Government is too big and the dumbest bill in America. This is Mark Fisher with Mark and the Millennials, and the Millennial joining me today is, of course, Christopher Hopkins, our producer, who's on the other side of the camera. Welcome, everyone, and welcome, Christopher Hopkins. This podcast is called Government is Too Big. Might be obvious to you that government is too big, but we have some examples of how government is too big and what happens to you when government continues to grow. First of all, before we go there, today is Juneteenth. And yesterday, technically, I guess, was the holiday, but today it's celebrated in the form of getting a day off. And I only bring this up, ladies and gentlemen, because in Washington, D.C., there was a Juneteenth celebration, as there were across America, and there was violence. There was gunfire. A 15-year-old was killed in Washington, D.C., and 3 others were wounded, including a police officer, during the Juneteenth celebration. Now think about this. Juneteenth is supposed to be a wonderful time when you're supposed to celebrate the freedom and the emancipation of the Black people that came to the United States and started out as slaves. And it's a celebration that we are beyond that, right? And it's a celebration of freedom. Okay, makes perfect sense to me. What I don't understand then is how that celebration and happiness erupts in gunfire. If there were ever, ladies and gentlemen, an example of what is wrong in the Black community today, and we see it every day in the inner cities across America, where we have Black on Black violence, yet we hear Black Lives Matter. We hear that again and again. Here we have a day of celebration, and yet we have violence and murder in the nation's capital. In the nation's capital. And who out there is actually willing to take this on and actually talk about it? Nobody. Like hardly anyone. You know, you hear people, they will nibble around the edges of this problem by saying, oh, isn't it awful? We have all this crime in these cities in America. No one wants to actually go right at the problem, which is, well, most of the crime and murders in these cities are being committed in areas that are occupied primarily by people who are Black. Now, that is really hard to say for so many people. I don't understand why we can't just talk about it and why we can't just acknowledge that there is a problem. There is a cultural problem. And we've had podcasts before about that subject. We're not going to cover that today, but I at least had to talk about the fact that yesterday was Juneteenth. Today it's being celebrated as well because it's, Juneteenth, the day off. Yesterday was Juneteenth, the holiday. I just think that there's a connection between that and what Christopher Hopkins told me before we started the podcast, which was it Snapchat? Mm. He received a notice yesterday, Christopher Hopkins did, on Snapchat that said, Happy Juneteenth. Not Happy Father's Day. Happy Juneteenth. And do you think for 1 minute, because I certainly do, out there in podcast land, that there's a connection between the lack of fathers in America and in particular in the Black community and what's happening across America in the inner cities and in the cities across America where you have Black on Black violence? Of course there's a connection. And then you have Snapchat basically acknowledging that Juneteenth is the holiday, but doesn't say, oh, by the way, Happy Father's Day. Look, I think fathers should have their own holiday. Okay. It should be a Father's Day. Obviously there's a Mother's Day and a Juneteenth. That is fine, but they should not be sharing the same holiday. But it's just kind of ironic that you have a big social media company saying, Happy Juneteenth, but, fathers don't matter. Yeah. And then you had this murderous attack in Washington, D.C. during a Juneteenth event. And it's like hard to not see the connection, ladies and gentlemen. I'm just saying. It's really hard and no one wants to actually talk about it. It's always nibble around the edges. Well, I'm afraid I'm going to be called a racist. No, you're not a racist by talking about facts. And the facts are that there is a cultural problem that has evolved and it has resulted in enormous black on black violence in America's cities. And it's awful that this is happening, and it's never going to change unless we actually talk about it. So next up, podcast listeners, we told you this podcast is called Government is Too Big. And I'm going to ask you the question, what can a government that is too big do? Well, what can a government that is too big not do? A bureaucracy that continues to grow and be empowered can be used to, coordinate attacks on citizens. If you have a bureaucracy that just grows and grows and you have elected officials that tell the bureaucracy, we're going to empower you to do these things, the bureaucracy kind of takes on a life of its own. We've spoken about this many times on Mark and the Millennials. The difference is that we have some really good examples of what is happening in America today, where the government has just gotten so big that it has decided through the leadership of those in charge that it can weaponize itself against people who criticize the government or whoever is in control of the government at that time. So in Fox News, Elon Musk votes for Mayra Flores in the Texas special election. And Elon Musk suggests he likes DeSantis for president. He also predicted a massive red wave that's coming in 2022. Now remember, this is Elon Musk, the darling of the left during the electric car early day craze. And now, of course, he is not the darling of the left anymore. And so Elon Musk is speaking out because he's obviously concerned about free speech. And what do you think happened as a result of Elon Musk speaking out that he voted for Flores in Texas? And he said it's, by the way, the first Republican he's ever voted for. And he voted for an Hispanic Republican in Texas who swept easily an election in a deep blue district in Texas that is, overwhelmingly Hispanic and is now trending each successive election Republican, and is now a Republican district because the people have chosen an Hispanic Republican woman to represent them in the United States Congress. Elon Musk, he voted for. And so what has happened in response? Well, he's revealed that he believes that the Democrat Party also is being run by unions and controlled by unions. And so you see story after story where Elon Musk is speaking out. And then what happens? The Biden administration opens up a new front in its war on Elon Musk's business empire. So when we said and asked you at the beginning of this podcast, is government too big? And what can government do or not do when it's too big? It can do pretty much anything, including weaponizing itself against someone who is a prominent American who speaks out like Elon Musk. So the Biden administration, and this is in the Daily Caller, the Biden administration has issued its latest decision impacting an Elon Musk business venture Monday, forcing SpaceX to take more than 75 environmental actions before moving ahead with its rocket launch plan in Texas. So think about this. You have SpaceX, okay? It's another Elon Musk company. It's the first actual rocket that can be landed in the exact place that you want it to be landed, namely in the middle of the ocean on top of a barge. I mean, that has never happened before, where a rocket lands in the exact space where you want. So Elon Musk has created this company, and the Biden administration, obviously angry at Elon Musk saying he's going to vote Republican, has decided that it's going to take, through its bureaucracy, 75 environmental actions before moving ahead with its rocket launch plans in Texas. So SpaceX must take a number of steps and actions, like donating $5,000 per year to both, an Ocelot Refuge and Peregrine Falcon Fund, and operating a shuttle from the parking lot to reduce traffic before proceeding with its proposed Starship Super Heavy project in Boca Chica, Texas, according to the Federal Aviation Administration announcement. So the Biden administration, obviously, ladies and gentlemen, they have weaponized an agency, the FAA, against Elon Musk because Elon Musk dares to talk about how there's going to be a Republican wave and he's voting Republican for the first time. And that he wants free speech, that he wants to buy Twitter, that he believes that there should be free speech in America. And so the Biden administration wants him to donate $5,000 per year to a Falcon Fund, a peregrine falcon fund, and an ocelot refuge. I guess that's how you say that name. I mean, these are two, birds that live in that area. And so they're trying to slow down any progress of SpaceX. The company, SpaceX, has proposed to use the facility to launch its Starship spacecraft and heavy super rocket, a reusable transportation system, the company said, is the most powerful launch vehicle ever made and could actually travel to Mars. Quote, "Why can't we build things anymore in the United States? Look at this absurd process the FAA is making SpaceX go through," Alex Stapp, the co-founder of the Institute for Progress, tweeted. Stapp highlighted that SpaceX will be required to boost local education and preservation efforts, including writing a historical report of the Boca Chica geographic area under the FAA announcement. So SpaceX will have to write an historical report of Boca Chica. Why wouldn't the government, like the local government, be responsible for that? Why would it be a private company that has nothing to do with the local history of the area? I mean, isn't there an historical society in Boca Chica? In addition, Musk's company must develop and produce 5 interpretive signs describing the history and significance of the area and the fund educational outreach about the region's cultural heritage, the agency said. SpaceX, now, what does this have to do with SpaceX? Nothing, except that the government is shaking him down. SpaceX will also be required to hire a biologist to conduct environmental monitoring within 3 miles of the site. SpaceX, though, celebrated the FAA announcement, saying that it was one step closer to the first orbital flight test of Starship. The company didn't respond to a request for comment from the Daily Caller News Foundation. The American Bird Conservancy, ABC for short, a group that has opposed SpaceX's proposed rocket launches in Boca Chica, said it was disappointed in the FAA ruling Monday. The group expressed concern that despite the FAA's requirements, the facility would still negatively impact local wildlife habitat, including the piping plover and red knot, 2 threatened species, and the endangered northern Aplomota falcon. So here's one of the takeaways, ladies and gentlemen, from this story in the Daily Caller, and that is Elon Musk chose to move his companies, right? The multiple companies that he has, the headquarters, to Texas, because he realized how unfriendly and hostile California had become to his companies. So he moved them. He headquartered them in Texas. But there's only one problem. Texas may welcome Elon Musk's companies, like SpaceX, for example, but you have to get federal approval from the FAA to be able to launch a rocket. Naturally, it makes sense because you don't want the rocket to hit an aircraft that's flying nearby, and it makes perfect sense. Except that the FAA is controlled by the federal government, and the federal government is controlled by Joe Biden's administration, and they want to shake down Elon Musk, which is exactly what they're doing. And so we ask the question, government is too big. What can government that is too big do? Well, when you criticize government, which you're supposed to be able to do in a republic, government that is too big can naturally shut you down, and they can slow you down. They can pretty much do anything, including look at your tax returns and try to find holes in it to try to come after you. And this is why it's so important that we limit the size of government. We limit the size of the federal government, and we limit the size of the state government, and we limit the size of the local government, because we never want our government to be so powerful that it tries to silence a citizen. I mean, it's just ridiculous that this could even happen. And so there's even an article in the Epoch Times. It says, Elon Musk, and we kind of talked about this before, he reveals who he believes actually is driving the Democrat Party. And so he just openly says it's the unions. It's why the Biden administration won't acknowledge that Tesla, as the world's leading developer and producer of electric cars, he won't even mention it. Biden won't even acknowledge that they exist because they're not unionized. And the unions drive what? They drive education in the United States, K to 12, because obviously, if you want to get elected in many places across the country, you need their union endorsements. The AFL-CIO. I mean, all of these organizations, which are unions, by the way, many of their members are wonderful people who are not partisan. They vote Republican, but the unions never support Republicans, ever. It's always about owning a politician. It's always about controlling a politician. So Elon Musk talks about it, and what ends up happening? Well, he has all of his businesses investigated, shaken down, and then, of course, they're even looking at his tax returns and trying to find holes in that as well. And another Elon Musk story, too, that I think is interesting is, this is worth watching closely, ladies and gentlemen, is Musk is still buying Dogecoin despite the cryptocurrency crash. So if you own cryptocurrency, you've been pretty much hosed, in my personal opinion. It has the full faith and credit of nothing behind it. I'm not saying that it could potentially be the future or one way to gain independence from spending money and overprinting money at the federal level. I get it. But I wanted to cover this story because Elon Musk, he's still buying Dogecoin, which most people thought was just that, a dog coin, which is worthless, more like a dog crap coin. But I'm going to read the story because it's kind of important. It's in the New York Post. Billionaire Elon Musk hasn't abandoned his support of the meme token Dogecoin, despite the collapsing prices of Bitcoin and other leading cryptocurrencies. The Tesla CEO indicated that he is adding to his Dogecoin stake, even as other investors dump their cryptocurrency and other risky assets in response to the Federal Reserve's move to tighten monetary policy through interest rate hikes. I will keep supporting Dogecoin, Musk tweeted on Sunday. When a Twitter user replied by saying Musk should keep buying it to show his support, the billionaire replied, I am. Dogecoin price was up more than 4% to about 6 cents per token. So it's a little confusing. So the price was up more than 4% based on, I'm sure, Elon Musk's tweet. But the actual price itself of a Dogecoin token is 6 cents. That's its actual value today, following Musk's tweets. The meme token also rose nearly 10% on Sunday, however. Dogecoin's price is still down more than 90% since hitting its all-time high of 74 cents in May of 2021. And look, this is no secret, ladies and gentlemen. What purchasers of Dogecoin hope for, not Elon Musk, but everybody else, all the regular investors, right? Not the billionaire investors, is, well, gee, if I buy it at 6 cents per token and it goes to $2, I'm going to be a pretty rich guy if I buy enough of it. You know, if I buy $10,000 worth of Dogecoin and it goes and its value increases from 6 cents per token to $2 per token, I mean, you're like, wow, this is like real money. And so that's why people take this risk. To me, it looks more like gambling at this particular point in time. But the thing is Elon Musk is no dummy. And that's why we wanted to read this article to you and at least talk about it, because he's obviously up to something. His intent is clearly to remake Dogecoin, in my opinion, for the purpose of using it as some sort of currency that can be used to purchase what? Probably Teslas. And maybe other things that he either is currently or will eventually produce. Musk has emerged as a major backer of Bitcoin, Dogecoin, and other cryptocurrencies in recent months, despite their propensity of volatile trading. Dogecoin has regularly surged in value when Musk speaks publicly about his interest. Last year, the price surged ahead of Musk's appearance as a guest host on Saturday Night Live, hitting its all-time high before quickly dipping once the episode aired. And it's kind of funny because you see a token of Dogecoin. It's just like the dog that's on it. It's just so stupid. When you think about it, it's like, in dogs we trust. I mean, what do you put on there? Exactly. It's just kind of silly. But we had to read it anyway because Elon Musk is a serious investor, clearly. He's very successful, and he's getting involved in Dogecoin. And meanwhile, of course, the government is doing everything that it can to investigate all of his businesses and try to shake him down so he gets in line and make sure he is going to support the Democrat Party. And you and I both know, ladies and gentlemen, that with GM being a union shop, Ford being a union shop, you know as well as I do that the Democrats that control Congress and that they're in charge of the White House, it is their intent to shake down Tesla and make it a union shop. Only one problem. Texas is a right-to-work state. And that's going to be very difficult in a right-to-work state to shake down Tesla. Yet another reason he moved to Texas. Really, really smart guy. And you just got to give it to him and understand that we live in a time when government is so big and so controlling and the bureaucracy is so massive that you, as the president of the United States, and maybe even a member of Congress, but certainly the president of the United States, can use that massive bureaucracy and weaponize it to shake down people that are saying things about you that are critical. And that is exactly what is not supposed to happen in our republic. And so next up, podcast listeners, Biden gets visibly angry and yells in a microphone over accusations of reckless spending. President Joe Biden yelled angrily into the microphone last week over accusations about his reckless spending at the 29th AFL-CIO convention in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Biden attempted to debunk Republicans' claims that he is a big spender and contributing to a rising deficit. He said the administration will cut the deficit by another $1.6 trillion in 1 year. Yeah, sure. So Biden goes to the FL-CIO and he speaks to them at their annual convention. And we have a clip of what he said. You're going to laugh out loud when you hear it. And here is the clip.
Republicans like to portray me as some kind of big spender. We have spent a lot of money. But let's compare the facts. Under my predecessor, the deficit exploded, rising every single year, and all the benefit going to the top 1%, basically. Under my plan, last year, we cut the deficit by $350 billion. Doing all this. You know, they talk about Biden wants to spend more on schools and all this. Guess what? He's going to create a deficit. Ladies and gentlemen, this year, by the end of the fiscal year, we will have cut the federal deficit by another $1.6 trillion in 1 year. 1 year. So when they come to you and talk about big spenders, let them know. Almost $2 trillion in deficit reduction. I don't want to hear any more of these lies about reckless spending. We're changing people's lives.
How do you like that yelling? We're changing people's lives. Let's talk about that because this is right in the sweet spot of this podcast, which is Government is too big. Yeah, government is too big. Government's not supposed to change people's lives. It's not the goal of government. It's people that are supposed to change their lives and the lives of their families and their communities. It comes from the people up. It doesn't come from the government down, which is literally what Biden is saying. We're changing people's lives because of all the spending, and that makes it okay. And then he goes on and says, we cut the deficit. Yeah, so real quick question, ladies and gentlemen. Do you really feel like he's cut the deficit with the inflation that's occurring? Do you really feel like things are better because you can't afford gas, you can't afford food, you can't afford electricity, but Biden is changing people's lives? Of course he's changing their lives. He's making them miserable, absolutely miserable. So in the Daily Caller, they actually fact-checked Biden. What a surprise. The president has taken credit for the drop in deficit spending when in actuality, it has been drastically reduced due to the end of the emergency pandemic spending, according to factcheck.org. Shortly after he took office, the Congressional Budget Office estimated the deficit to drop by $874 billion in 2021. So it had nothing to do with Biden taking office. The budget deficit was already decreasing because we spent so much during the pandemic. It was emergency spending because the thought process was at the beginning of 2020, what? Thought process was that everybody was going to die from this pandemic, that literally there'd be mass death and perhaps the human race would be wiped out. I mean, certainly that was the narrative at the time. And so the government went and passed these emergency bills that involved incredible amounts of spending. And so then, Biden gets in, continues to spend like crazy unnecessarily, but for things unrelated to the pandemic. In other words, he wants to change people's lives by controlling everything that you do, making government do everything, of course, and then basically saying, well, I cut the budget deficit. What a bunch of nonsense. Do you really feel better off with the price of things? So after Biden passed the American Rescue Plan, the deficit was then expected to drop by $124 billion, Fact Check reported. The legislation is expected to raise the national debt by $3.8 trillion by 2031. So that's according to the CBO. The president also signed the bipartisan $1.2 trillion infrastructure bill into law November 15th, which was last year, which the CBO estimated would add another $256 billion to the nation's debt over 10 years. He also attempted, unsuccessfully, Biden did, to pass the Build Back Better legislation, which intended to provide another $273 billion in tax credits for daycare and early childhood education. In other words, more indoctrination for your children at the earliest possible age, a social safety net provision that would add a child tax credit and expand Obamacare. The CBO expected and estimated the legislation would also add $367 billion to the national debt. So in other words, all of Biden's bills, whether they passed or didn't pass last year, would have added enormous amounts of monies to the national debt, completely lying to the AFL-CIO. But of course, the operatives who show up at the AFL-CIO, these are the people that try to shake down small companies, medium-sized companies, and big companies like Tesla. Those operatives, they're all in because it's all about collecting dues from the union shop members and then enriching the unions and then buying off politicians by supporting the politicians with large donations. And then the politicians, of course, then feel obligated to do whatever the unions want. We see that with the teachers' unions, right? You have enormous amounts of teachers in the United States who are just fantastic teachers, wonderful teachers. But then you have those operatives in the unions that are literally taking control of education and making things worse. Same thing happens with the AFL-CIO, which is doing the same thing with car companies and trying to do everything they can to run them into the ground. And they can't wait to get their fingers into Tesla, but they can't. Why? Because Tesla is in Texas, which is a right-to-work state, which I think is hysterically funny. Hysterically funny. So when we talk about, ladies and gentlemen, is government too big? Of course it is, because when your president of the United States says, we're changing people's lives with all this spending, you know there's something wrong, because that is not what government is supposed to do. Definitely not what it's supposed to do at the federal level. What they're supposed to do at the federal level is the absolute minimum. Protect the country's defense. And in addition to that, to make sure that the country is, running smoothly and to follow the Constitution of the United States. Instead, they want to change people's lives in every way imaginable. And that's We're Changing People's Lives by Joe Biden. Next up, podcast listeners, Biden issues executive order for grooming. I can't make this up. So Biden announces sweeping executive order to advance radical LGBTQI plus agenda in schools. The new executive order bans conversion therapy, which now includes suggesting that a child should not undergo medical transition. So let's explain this. So it's 2022 and up is down. The sky is purple. Gas prices are sprinting towards $10. Monkeypox is bigoted. And now executive orders are being used to groom your kids. Welcome to the hell that Joe Biden's America is. And this is in the Gateway Pundit, of course. Kind of funny. On Wednesday, Joe Biden announced he would be signing, and this is true, another executive order to bolster the left's radical gender identity crusade in schools across America. The sweeping executive order will provide funding to the Department of Education in order to create a new advocacy group that issues guidance on LGBTQI plus policies to states, school districts, and other educational institutions, and also sends resources to the Department of Health and Human Services that would focus on gender identity affirmation services for students in the United States. In other words, K-12. This is an executive order, which is basically an edict, right? It's completely extra constitutional. And once again, is government too big? You absolutely are right. Government's too big. This is not the function of government, not the function of your federal government. One of the main goals of the new legislation will be to expand access to destructive gender-affirming drugs and medical procedures for children, despite mounting evidence of the severe long-term consequences, such as sterility, bone loss, many other health issues, and increased suicide rates among young people who are coerced into medically transitioning. Thanks to a few researchers who are finally doing the work and looking into this issue, the results are becoming crystal clear. Gender-affirming care, which entails pumping children full of puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones, is making the problem measurably worse. But it shouldn't take a scientist or a clinical study to see that we should not be giving young children who don't have the faculties to make these types of life-altering decisions on their own drugs that are used to chemically castrate pedophiles, Lupron, and puberty blocker, let alone giving young, healthy girls double mastectomies in the name of gender affirmation. It's unspeakable what these monsters are doing to America's children. And now Biden is mandating this poison with a stroke of the pen. Now, how can we have an executive order, which is an edict, basically willy-nilly spending money across the Department of Education and pushing that money from the federal Department of Education down to the states and to the counties and to the local municipalities, so that there's now money to make this available to children in K-12. Ladies and gentlemen, this is just insane. And if you ask yourself the question, which is the name of this podcast, is government too big? Well, just look at that. Of course, government's too big. It's out of control. And we, the people, deserve to push back on government. And there are ways that we can push back on government. And we've talked about many of those ways. And the Convention of States is one of those ways, which we've talked about, which allows us, we the people, to have an Article 5 Convention of States to tame the federal government. And that includes these absurd executive orders. I'm sorry, the President of the United States is not a king. was never intended to be a king, and by definition, an executive order is king-like. It's a king-like edict. Not only did Biden do that, of course, this executive order for forcing all of these drugs to K-12 kids, who on earth would do that, okay? And oh, by the way, Biden considers himself to be a Catholic. Can you imagine? You know, he's such a devout Catholic. He's such a devout Catholic that he signed such an executive. What a joke. This man isn't religious. He's not religious at all. The Michigan AG, Dana Nessel, calls for a, quote, drag queen for every school during her woke conference. So it's not just Biden, it's an attorney general? What does the attorney general have to do with public education? Well, in Michigan, their attorney general, Dana Nessel, called for a drag queen for every school during a Wednesday conference in which attendees look at discrimination through a systems lens. Quote, drag queens make everything better. Drag queens are fun, Nessel said at the 2022 Michigan Civil Rights Summit, according to audio obtained by the Detroit News. The summit, hosted by the Michigan Department of Civil Rights, featured several top Michigan state officials, as well as Housing and Urban Development Secretary Marcia Fudge, who addressed the crowd virtually. Quote, drag queens are entertainment. And you know what I'll say, what that was totally not poll tested. I'd say this, a drag queen for every school, Nessel added. So let's say this again. Nessel says, quote, drag queens are entertainment. And you know what I'll say that was totally not poll tested. I'll say this, a drag queen for every school, she said. So in other words, you have the Michigan AG saying that you should have a drag queen in every school, K-12, because they're entertainment. Now, you have to, obviously, we've talked about this before, ask yourself the question, what kind of a sick pervert who's an adult thinks it's okay to put a cross-dresser, because that's what we used to call them, that's what they are, into K-12 education and dressed in a very sexual way, causing all kinds of questions to children who have no business seeing this nonsense. This is an adult who is very sick. This is a groomer, right? Nessel is an AG. Her job is to enforce the law of Michigan, right? That's her job. And instead, what she wants to do is groom children in K-12 school. So where do you go in Michigan then if you want to correct the problems of your state with respect to crazy elected officials who've just lost their minds? Well, really the only place to go is to find people to run for office to beat this individual. Problem is that the Biden administration has decided to weaponize the government, the federal government that is, against Michigan. For example, Michigan judge orders the GOP candidate for governor in Michigan to surrender his guns. So a Michigan Republican candidate for governor, Ryan Kelly, who will have to surrender his guns while he awaits trial on a misdemeanor criminal charges in connection with the January 6, 2020 U.S. Capitol breach, he had to surrender his guns. So this guy, he's the Republican candidate for governor, Ryan Kelly in Michigan, says that he never went into the Capitol, but that he was outside the Capitol, but he never went in. And a judge was like, too bad, we're gonna take away your guns. And of course, we're going to do everything we can to make it difficult for you to win as governor in the state of Michigan. And look, I'll be frank with you folks. There's no way that we can possibly know as civilians whether this gentleman indeed went in or didn't go into the Capitol. We don't know. Okay. But what we do know is this, that the federal government is doing everything it can to weaponize itself against Republican candidates because the Democrats know they're in such massive trouble. And Michigan is one of those states they want to continue to control. The Democrats want to continue to control it because it's a very important state as it relates to the Republican Party and the Democrat Party for winning national elections for president. And so you have the Michigan AG who wants a drag queen in every school. And then you have it's okay that she's a groomer. And then you have this guy who's protesting his government on January 6th, and he's the bad guy. I'm sorry, ladies and gentlemen. Our country is in such trouble. Government is way too big, and it's way out of control. And to make fun of all this, the Babylon Bee did such a great job, the past 2 weeks in particular. In the Babylon Bee, it says, tampon supply shortage. Now, you guys know that there are shortages of baby formula. There are shortages in some grocery stores, bread and meat, chicken. The prices are out of control. I mean, there are literally shortages across America for all kinds of things. There are lumber shortages, lumber prices. I mean, just everywhere you go, the economy is in trouble in so many different ways because of the Biden administration. So the Babylon Bee did a story, and it says, tampon supply shortage solved by emptying out tampons in the men's bathrooms. So it's kind of funny, right? Because if you have a tampon shortage, which to the best of my knowledge there isn't, but it's Babylon Bee spoofing this, then if you live in Democrat cities or Democrat counties across America, or even Democrat states, you could probably just go into the men's room because they are now being put inside of men's rooms, as we all know. And that's a true story. So like all humor, there's a funny part of this that's true. And the other part that's not necessarily true is that there is indeed a tampon shortage. So way to go, Babylon Bee. Another great story. So gotta love this stuff. So the next thing, ladies and gentlemen, is we have a daily Biden dumpster fire. We don't have a clip on this because we had to do a daily Biden dumpster fire of how Biden is threatening the oil companies. Now imagine you live in a republic and you have a president of the United States, and he's decided he's going to attack and use the size of government and the largesse of government to attack an entire industry, an industry that is critical for national security and critical to economic security. That is the daily Biden dumpster fire. He's out there and he unloads on oil companies with thinly veiled threats. So get this. Oil companies and industry trade groups criticized President Joe Biden after he sent a letter of them threatening action over high gasoline prices. Biden penned a letter to 7 major oil companies Tuesday, insisting they increase oil refining operations to counter declining fuel supplies and inventories nationwide. The American Petroleum Institute and the American Fuel and Petrochemical Manufacturers Association sent a letter to the White House Wednesday evening saying energy companies are refining at an increasingly high rate and government policies have injected uncertainty into the industry, in a response sent to the White House last week. Quote, refiners do not make multi-billion-dollar investments based on short-term returns. The two groups wrote in the joint letter to Biden. Quote, they look at long-term supply and demand fundamentals and make investments as appropriate. To that end, following on your campaign promise to end fossil fuel, considering just some of the policy and investment signals being sent by various federal agencies and allied state governments to the market about our refining industry. The timing and reasons for shutdowns of several refineries, including the Philadelphia Energy Solutions and Shell Convent refineries, were primarily due to lack of buyers willing to continue operating the facilities as petroleum refineries, given growing rhetoric about the long-term viability of the industry, the letter continued. So let me abbreviate what was just said by those two industry groups. They're saying, look, we make investments in our industry to expand more natural gas and oil and to refine more natural gas and oil. These long-term investments are considered long-term because it takes years to find new places with oil, Then it takes years to build and maintain the refineries, to refine it. And so those are long-term investments that don't just like happen on a dime. And why would we do that if we have a federal government that is being weaponized, that's so big, and allied state governments like New York State and California and Maryland and Illinois, they're basically saying to these oil companies, we want to put you out of business. Why on earth would they invest money? And so therein lies the reason why we have energy inflation in the United States. And therein lies the reason why this is today's daily Biden dumpster fire, because they have created literally this problem in the United States, the Biden administration, and the weaponization of his bureaucracy by telling the people that are the linchpin of our economy, right, the energy industry, to not invest in the energy anymore and not invest in their industry anymore because the Biden administration wants to put them out of business. So why would they make any investments whatsoever? Why would they do any more than they have to? Because they are stockholder-held companies, right? The stockholders own these companies, and it is the responsibility of these companies to answer to the stockholders and make money for the stockholders. And you can't do that, of course, as a company if you have the government that's ahead of the country in which you're located telling you that they're trying to put you out of business. And while all this might be perfectly obvious to you, ladies and gentlemen, that's why we're doing this podcast on government is too big. What can a government that is too big not do? They can do anything that it wants. And that's exactly what this government is doing to all of us. It's literally crushing the middle class. It's making the poor poorer. It's making the middle class much poorer because now they're dipping into their savings and they're cutting back their way of life, their standard of living. And then there's no end in sight because the oil companies are saying, we're not making more investments because you want us to be gone. You want us to be dead. And of course, Biden administration, you've ever asked them the question, by the way, how do you fly in an airplane without petroleum? How do you make plastics without petroleum? Right? I mean, how do you generate the level of electricity that we need for all the electric cars without petroleum? You can't. Okay? You can't. How do you ship things from one end of the country without petroleum? Because the shipping is usually on diesel engine driven trains or diesel engine driven trucks. You can't. You can't. And that's the daily Biden dumpster fire. And next up, podcast listeners, we have the dumbest bill in America. And do we have a lead up, Mr. Producer? Yep. Here it is. Dum 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 dum. And it's the dumbest bill in America, and it is rejecting the tax-exempt status of conservatives. Oh, how Obama of you. That's right, rejecting tax-exempt status, but just of conservative groups, naturally. California Democrats, ladies and gentlemen, aim to target the tax-exempt status of patriot groups. Yeah, just conservative groups, in other words. California Democrats appear to be using the January 6 hearings in Washington, D.C. as a catalyst to push legislation aimed at targeting the tax-exempt status of patriot groups in the state. The legislation suggests these groups might pose a threat of insurrection. Senate Bill 834 in California would authorize the state attorney general, Rob Bonta, the same guy that had the California exit tax, to review nonprofit groups and refer cases to the California Franchise Tax Board to possibly remove their tax-exempt status, supposedly to protect against insurrection. So in other words, Senate Bill 834 would protect against a thought crime, right? You hadn't committed any crime. You hadn't suggested to anyone that you were going to commit a crime. You never even thought about committing a crime. You're just running your tax-exempt status patriot group, in other words, pro-America group or America First group. And Rob Bonta, the Attorney General of California, is saying, well, it's a thought crime to have a patriot group, so therefore we're going to remove your tax-exempt status because you might do something. It's nuts, ladies and gentlemen. This is so Obama-esque, right? Remember how Obama, and we talked to Mark Meckler about this when he was on our podcast. Remember how Obama used Lois Lerner and the IRS to shake down the tax-exempt status by not granting tax-exempt status to patriot groups and to the Tea Party groups across America? Well, in this case, California is basically saying, if you already have tax-exempt status, we're going to just, shake you down, but only if you are a patriot group, only if you are Republican, only if. And so, quote, removing tax-exempt status by AG determination without a method to redress basically makes the AG of California the judge, the jury, the executioner for nonprofits and their tax-exempt status in the state, all under the guise of January 6, according to the source. Catherine Engelbrecht, founder of True the Vote, questioned why, if the bill is non-political, as Democrats claim, don't its supporters mention violent left-wing nonprofit groups? Of course they don't. Quote, so are they referring to Black Lives Matter and Antifa, the organizations that have wreaked havoc on so much of our country, including destroying so many cities in America? We are at a sobering moment in America, quote, where the political echo chamber in places like California and others, where there is very little divergence of thought, tolerated quickly morphs from a republic to tyranny, she told the Epoch Times. It should be a sobering warning to any Californian with pro-liberty mindsets. It sounds like they're being marked for takedown. It's exactly what's happening here. And then the Epoch Times even references the IRS scandal, of course. So the bill seems to propose legalizing tactics eerily similar to those used by the Internal Revenue Service during President Barack Obama's administration to target patriot groups, including the Tea Party. And this is right from the Epoch Times. News of the IRS scandal broke in May 2013, but the nefarious activities of the agency had begun more than 3 years before then. In August 2010, the IRS made a list of groups to target, especially those with Tea Party or Patriots, or 912 in their names, according to a Treasury Inspector General report released on May 14th of 2013. California, ladies and gentlemen, is doing the exact same thing. The exact same thing, except in California, they're saying, well, if you already have that tax-exempt status, we're going to make sure that we deny the tax-exempt status based on what you might do, not based on your behavior, not based on whether you're lawfully using your tax-exempt status, which, of course, the vast majority of these groups are lawful and are just patriots and good, solid Americans. But that's not allowed in California. Of course it's not, because you can no longer have diversity of thought in places like California, which is why, ladies and gentlemen, which is why people like Elon Musk have left, which is why so many of the tech titans like Peter Thiel and so many others have left California and moved to other places, moved to other states, domiciled somewhere else, primarily Texas and Florida. Rejecting the tax-exempt status of one group versus another is wrong. It's obviously what Democrats do when they're in office, which is to completely and utterly weaponize government. And it's why it is the dumbest bill in America. And that's it for Mark and the Millennials. And that's it for the dumbest bill in America, rejecting the tax-exempt status of conservatives. Thank you for joining Mark and the Millennials. This is Mark Fisher. Thank you to our producer, Christopher Hopkins. Check us out on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Facebook, Getter, Twitter, Truth Social, Rumble, and our website. See you next time.